Are you a fundamentalist, or were you raised a fundamentalist? I have a little bit of direct experience in this area and have some thoughts on that I wanted to share with you. In the past, you've argued if a prominent Christian was an atheist before or not, and there's only secondary evidence that has been gathered in this point, and while that's an interesting discussion, it doesn't really get to the point. The guy has given a testimony of how things were, and that's kind of where things are at. I'm needing to speak to this because others have taken your lead and are going away from there and providing information that isn't entirely correct. Let's first look at the sociological level about what's going on with the different groups. So if we look at libertarianism, for example, on the issue of clothing, it's free expression on clothes and jewelry, whatever you want to wear, you feel like you do. There's a continuum, and in the middle, people tend to follow social mores in the sociological level, for example, and the fundamentalist, where there's external specified clothing that you're going to wear, certain kind of clothing where a shirt doesn't have a collar or something like that. That's externally specified. But we also have to regard that there's a thing called statistical regression to the mean. In this libertarian group is a group that I wanted to mention at least briefly. It's a nudist colony that's near Hamilton, Ontario. Statistical regression to the mean. They start wearing clothes when it starts becoming December in Hamilton because it's not really warm enough there to engage in a nudist colony in the winter. And on the other side, extra effort is required for people to meet the requirements, and some of those they tend to move in on towards the center. So there is a statistical regression of the mean. Now on the religious side, if you were raised as a fundamentalist, wouldn't you have been able to go to movies in the first place? Movies are considered as worldly, and it's been externally dictated that going to movies is wrong, negative, or evil. And I'm aware of at least one movie that you've seen that has changed your life. Now I'm going to ask you some questions about the church that you grew up in, and use this as a gauge as well. How many women in the church wore dresses because Mel Brown or somebody else had told them to do so? How many men in that same church drove black cars without trim because Mel or somebody else told him to? Mel would not tell you about movies or much else because it would cause offense. Dr. Carl Lentz, who was there before, would not forbid going to movies either, but I'm sure that he would give you something to think about as you were going. What are you seeing? What are you thinking about? Having known him, I'm aware that this would likely happen. And neither of these would actually shun you. And it was interesting, one of the early times that I had met Dr. Carl after having moved from Ontario, he told me that one of his master's degrees that he did was on shunning. He would take the summer off and go away to school and get a master's degree, and he would do that once in a while at this point, and one of them was on shunning. So he had told me there's a remarkable difference between Mormons and Jehovah's Witness shunning and that done in the Mennonite Church, and the objectives are different. The Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses are aimed to keep your ideas out of the congregation if there's something that you are thinking or believing that they shouldn't. And it's to keep those ideas from entering into their heads. And it's also seen as a club. It's a club in the hall closet. And if you're thinking about something or you're asking questions that would be seen to be problematic in some way, they'll open the hall closet and show you the club and say, if you persist in this fashion, then you're going to be kicked out. And it's both an active thing to keep you away from the rest of them if they think that there's an issue, or it's also used as a technique to keep you in and to keep you from asking questions. On the Mennonite side, it's to show you that you've done wrong and get you into a place where you could be right, and to show you how to get there. And the idea is to help you fix your problems and get back. With Mormons and Jehovah's Witness shunning, or more particularly the Jehovah's Witnesses, their disfellowshipping causes you to most likely lose your job, lose your house, lose your friends, in addition to going to church. So you've lost a whole bunch of things that way. And the Mennonites, it's a loss of some church privileges, but other aspects of life are okay. You'll probably remember in the early 1990s, there was a case of church discipline that took place in that church that we're talking about. Somebody had told some lies, and it involved potentially defrauding some people in the church or something like that, and because it was illegal, they needed to deal with it. Because this guy was hurting, we took the opportunity to visit when we could, and to be an encouragement to him. And in this whole plan that they had, that I talked about, where there was a restriction on membership, they also had set forth a plan of remediation to help him get back to where he needed to be. There's a case where you may have seen where it's dramatically different than the standard method that the Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons might use. Probably the biggest concern in this whole area is that in John 15 and John 17, they talk about us being in the world but not being of it. And at some point in time you have to draw lines. And it really depends on the group that you're with and other things where the lines are drawn. Do you go to the movie theater, or do you only go to F, the PG, R, or where do you draw the line? And some people draw the lines in different spots because of situations in their families, or their personal choices. Horror movies tend not to go well with me. Watching them and then going to bed, it tends not to work. And I've been a part of several self-declared fundamental churches in Toronto and elsewhere, and what I've seen is that the church that you grew up in is nothing like those. Chief among the issues would be trust. Internal choices on hair, clothing, and style and cars are not hallmarks of fundamentalism. Distrust of others is not as pronounced in your church as with others. And if you look back to where you were and you talk to people in the church and they don't answer you because they don't know you, you say hello to them because you're sitting in the same row of pews, and they say they don't want to talk to you because they don't know you, that's something that you would see as more of a hallmark on a sociological level in a fundamentalist church. And I've talked to some of the people in there and saying that they're about as friendly as a junkyard dog. Didn't win me a lot of points, but I went on to explain that it takes them a while to warm up to friends, and they don't warm up to strangers. Junkyard dog, that's probably a good idea, but in church where we're supposed to be doing things together, and if they don't warm up like that, then it's very hard to try and be a part of a church like that. Another thing is, in churches like that, gossip is a lot more prevalent. An example from that same place was when I broke my foot when I was in Quebec. I couldn't work there and then went back to Toronto. And my landlord's, the place that he was renting the house from was Ricky Glover. Ricky Glover saw me come in crutches, with a cast on my foot. He looked down to the cast, looked up to me, looked down, and looked up. And my answer was, yes, it is. And then later on I found that his explanation is much more embellished about what happened in Quebec. He said, where I was, I'm outside their church, and in Quebec they don't love God. And I was out boozing, I broke my foot late at a dance. And what I was actually doing was walking across the street in the middle of the day to go downtown to get a newspaper. So he was spreading that around, and it had no basis in reality. And you see that kind of thing, unfortunately, in a lot of those churches, and it certainly is a problem. When you pick up and leave and you go for a vacation or so and you wanted to attend church while you're gone, would you need a letter from the leaders to introduce you to the new church you're going to over here? If you haven't heard of that, I'll tell you more about that. The church that I was a part of, if I wanted to go to a church that was of like faith, in order to get in, I would need to have them write a letter to the elders of their, the leaders of this church, and they would specify the church. Jim is going to be there on this date and he wants to worship. But with the amount of traveling that I was doing, and I was roaming all over the place, it really depended on my schedule and so on, whether I would go to this church or I would go to a church someplace else, or not at all. So it was really very hard to come up with a workable solution where they're writing letters almost every week to somebody that I would be going to, and it was just too much of a bother to be involved in that. But that's what they needed to do. So you don't need a letter to go to another church of like faith to introduce you. And when I attended your church took me in on face value when I visited. And another thing that I noted is that about 2/3 of the way back from the front, there wasn't a gate that closed during the service, as in some churches. They have a two-tier church membership situation, and certain things happen in the front that doesn't happen in the back. And I didn't see that there, and that's another facet that you see in a fundamentalist church. You've talked about the Hassan bite model, and I wanted to look at that some more. It's used to look at mind control groups, and I've discussed mind control groups in the past when I was traveling all over the place, and then I've looked at it again to ensure that I've got it right. But the material that was presented there about that was taken out of context. And some of the examples was chanting. Hassan had talked about chanting, and then the extraction was drawn to singing in church. Singing in church for 20 minutes on Sundays is something that's set against this as a truth. And you've talked about old order churches, and some of the family has said what's happening. In the Low German, they got a fellow that would lead the singing called a Fezinga, and the story is told in Low German how he stands up and says, because of the lack of time, we're going to only sing the first 12 verses and the last 16 of this. And it was, in Low German, it was really, really slow. That is a cultural thing, and I've actually seen that happen in English as well, where you got a guy that looks an awful lot like the Fezinger, the song leader. He would pick the song and pick the music, and then you'd have to pick it and then sing along. I've seen that happen in English as well, and there's some other interesting things that happened there, where people that were part of the church sat at one table, and those that weren't a part of the church sat at a different one, maybe even in a different room when you're having Sunday lunch. And the distinctions that are made there are most interesting. But what Hassan was talking about there was chanting seen in Hare Krishna, the International Society of Krishna Consciousness, and the Unification Church. If you've seen the movie Ticket to Heaven, the new convert is in the van and they're going out someplace to do some fundraising, and they're banging on the roof of the van saying, "Praise the Lord, bring in the money," and they're doing that all the way to where they're going. And this is an example of the chanting that they're talking about. And ISKCON, they have a prayer cycle that's 1,728 times. Did you say this chant in a cycle, and it lasts about 2 hours. You do that multiple times a day and before certain major events. Is there something where the church would be concerned with this and be involved or be considered as a mind control group because of chanting, because they sing? No. Not on what you're talking about. Another big thing that both these groups have, but they call it slightly different, is heavenly deception. That's what the Unification Church calls it. Because they're out looking for money for them, they can tell you whatever they want, and as to what it is. It's for a senior's home, or it's a park for kids, or whatever. They'll tell you, and then it's for them. And downtown near the Skydome in Toronto, I've been arrested by the Hare Krishna for smiling without a permit. So I'd asked them, what's it really for? And they told me that it was to bring organic rice into the Algonquin Park. This is an area where organic rice wouldn't grow, and he's just telling me something, and the money is going back to the Krishna temple. And you're talking about diet, and I want to encourage you not to confuse cultural choices with ordered food choices. Hassan talks about a diet that's limited in protein and calories, and I'm going to ask you, if you look at a plate that's put in front of you with Rijkewurst, farmer sausage, Greven, Kielke, and Schmeltfat. So that's farmer sausage, some cracklings in the gravy in the bottom. It's like pierogies with a really heavy cream sauce on. Do you see something that's limited in calories there, or protein? I'm going to have to submit that you don't. So I'm going to say that you can't be necessarily saying this about a church in general, or one that you grew up in, exercising mind control in the area of diet. And in Hassan's world, a limited diet and a lack of sleep, it leads to a loss of critical thinking and resistance, and you can't recognize error in the things that you're told. And the speaker had said that lack of sleep is not an issue with the Mennonite church. Lack of discernment is not a goal in any Mennonite church, and it's irresponsible to suggest that it is. One of the things that Hassan has talked about as well is communal living. Yes, some groups do that. We see that with ISKCON and with the Moonies. That's pictured in Ticket to Heaven. And what we see in a situation like that is that pooled resources are inflicted. When you come into the group, you give them whatever you have, and you give it to the leaders, and then you live in a communal fashion. But that's not a hallmark of a mind control group. The Catholics do this. Convents are a place where people are able to get room and board and food, and they get some living expenses. They do this if they agree up front. They sort of lay the scenario out, and for them they provide them with a living area and tools and things that they need communally, and then things that they need for individual things, so that if you're interested in doing woodwork or fixing the car, so that there's tools that are available for you to be doing that sort of thing. And the reason for something like this, why it would be seen to be an advantage is that property held in common reduces expenses per person if they agree. If I'm in this commune and I need some tools, the tools are commonly available for the whole group, and we only have to purchase one set of them, not the set for me and the set for others. Now, let's have a look. You've talked a little bit about where the grandparents lived. How was Edinburgh set up? This is an old colony Mennonite settlement. It's with individual houses. They're fairly close together because it's an area where this family helps that one. If there's some problem, somebody is sick or they need additional help, the people from around will come and help. But they all live in individual houses, so there's some common sharing of help between places as individual farms as it's needed. Hutterites have an arrangement that's not unlike this. The equipment that they have is held in common, but they live in individual houses, and they all work together towards a common good, and whatever success they have in their endeavors is put communally together, and it's a rather large operation, and it takes somewhat to pay for the expanse of land that they have and all the different endeavors that they're doing to provide food for themselves and others outside as a source of income. And Amish, they live in their own houses, and they're in a neighborhood, and they are known to be able to help others as well with the things. You're talking about segregation in church, and a minority of churches do this as suggested, and most commonly it might be with a curtain. But just so you know, Orthodox Jews do this too. And what's the goal? For the Jews, it's to focus on God. And after having had the Shabbat service, there's a common area at the back where they will have a meal called a Kiddushim, and men and women are able to interact there in common, and the children too. So everybody is interacting at this meal after the Shabbat service. Why might Mennonites do this? It's possibly to help people, maybe even the younger ones, from having eyes wandering over and being distracted as they're trying to teach. Why do cults do it? It's more for breaking off critical thinking. Something is told to you and you don't want to sit there and have somebody processing that in order to try and figure it out. And then there's also the business of distractions. The most important thing that we need to say in total is that not all is as it was billed in what you're saying.